Good morning. I'm Arlie Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 22nd, 2023. Let me begin by just mentioning that as of late yesterday, Ron DeSantis announced he's withdrawing from the presidential campaign for the Republican nomination. This is just another interesting development in what's turning into a very fast moving situation in which it is apparent that we're going to be headed toward a Trump-Biden election campaign in November. Now, when I say apparent, there's a lot that can happen, including legal operations, wars, financial collapse, any number of developments. So nothing is written in stone, except that what's important is that we understand who's shaping the political environment in the United States and toward what end. And that's why I've chosen as my topic today, why are we involved in permanent wars? Who benefits from them? And what is the alternative? What can be done about it? Now, the Executive Intelligence Review Online has published a series of articles in the last weeks to look at this phenomena of what used to be called the military-industrial complex, but which is more properly known as the military financial industrial complex. And that's because of the role of banks, financial institutions, and Silicon Valley, and the expansion beyond merely the military defense sector. But I'm going to be taking a look today at the articles that we've written, and they'll be linked in the bottom of the description page because they're absolutely crucial for people who want to be involved in presidential politics, national campaigns, who just want to be part of shaping a better future, to know who you're dealing with and what the cause of our problems are. Now, the first article that came out was "The Military Financial Complex is Bloated on Blood Money from Wars." And it has three charts, which you'll see when you log on to it. First one is a list of companies owned by Wall Street speculators. These are military production companies. The five largest are Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technology, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and General Dynamics. And the three financial companies that are among the leading investors and stockholders of these corporations are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Not surprising. Now then, the second chart is on the military sales revenue and the percent of the total revenue of these companies that comes from defense contracts. So Lockheed Martin, for example, took in $59.4 billion in revenues, 96% of which was from defense production. The second one, Raytheon, almost $40 billion, 59% from military contracts. Northrop Grumman, $32.3 billion, 89% of its income or revenue comes from military contracts. Boeing, $29.3 billion, 46%, and General Dynamics, $28.3 billion, 77%. So, and this is with a national defense budget now close to $1 trillion. So a significant amount of money is passing to these companies, which have a vested interest in policies of minimally scaring people into thinking we have to spend more money on defense, but more importantly for them, actually engaging in wars where the production is necessary. Now, the third chart is on retooling. I won't go through it. It's an interesting concept. But what it talks about is, for example, with Lockheed Martin, their F-35 fighter bomber cost $1 million, $100 million, $100 million per plane. They get about $12 billion a year from producing these things. What could be done with that $12 billion? How many new bridges could be built? How many power plants, including coal-fired and nuclear? How many miles of high-speed rail could be laid in the United States? How much improvement could there be to the water system? If you take the expenditures as a whole, you're talking about a huge amount of money which now is wasted by going into these never-ending losing wars like Afghanistan, as we're now stuck in Ukraine, as it looks like we're going to be supporting another one of these in Southwest Asia, the possibility of a war with China. This is throwing money into a rat hole. But who is at the end of the rat hole? Well, what Blinken and others are saying, including Lloyd Austin, the good news is this goes to Americans. Well, who are the Americans who get it? Well, that's why you have to look at what BlackRock and State Street represent. These are two of the largest asset management companies in the world. They sell financial instruments to wealthy clients to create pools of money from those clients that they can invest in military industries and also buying land and raw materials. BlackRock is the world's largest asset management firm. It's now managing $9.4 trillion in funds. It's created 1,300 investment vehicles, which people put their money in, that money is then channeled into whatever direction the CEO, Lawrence Fink, decides to push it. Now, Fink made his money in mergers and acquisitions in the 1980s. And this was a project, the mergers and acquisitions, was essentially a laundering of organized crime money, drug money, the creation of junk bonds, the role of Michael Milken and others, who created the idea of financial innovation, new financial instruments that could be used to take over old firms, sell off the parts of firms that they didn't want to spend money on, including cutting research and development, and turn some of the old companies of the United States into floating casinos. That's what the whole 1980s economic financial innovation amounted to. And it was only possible by breaking the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and creating a floating exchange rate where the essential question of money was determined by the Federal Reserve and other central banks, which are privately owned agencies. They're not government agencies. Now, Fink was hired in 2020 by the US Fed to run the Federal Reserve's purchases of corporate bonds and commercial mortgages. So now you have the Central Bank of the United States acting on behalf of private banks, buying up stocks and bonds to essentially put money into a system which many of the companies whose stocks and bonds they're buying are bankrupt. But they're keeping them in business by providing liquidity to enable them to claim that they can cover the face value if someone has a run against them. Now, minimally, this is a conflict of interest, the largest asset management company handling the Federal Reserve's purchases. Now, this came into existence because of the crisis in the repo markets, the repurchasing markets in 2019, in which banks lacked the liquidity to loan to the desperately over-indebted corporations that needed overnight loans, which is what the repo market is, overnight loans to avoid default. And so now you have the Fed buying and selling instruments to provide cash to this repo market so that banks have money to lend to their bankrupt corporate customers to allow them to continue to carry their assets at face value on their books. This is a scam. This should have been shut down. But the regulatory agencies were destroyed. Why? Because these bankers funded politicians who proposed the solution of deregulation, getting rid of federal control, federal law. Now, some of the regulations of the U.S. economy are ridiculous, but some of them, especially when it comes to banking, especially when it comes to making sure that when you put money in your account, in a retirement account or a savings account, that it's going to be there when you need it. Well, you take that away, the regulation away, and what happens? A floating pool of money in the hands of speculators who then conclude that the best investments they can find are the military industrial companies. Now, it also This happened in 2020. It was the repo market crisis was 2019. What else happened in 2020? The lockdowns and shutdowns of COVID. And so this policy came into being at the point where they knew they needed to take power away from elected governments and put it entirely in the hands of technocrats acting on behalf of these private banks and financial interests. Now, Business Week had an article in 2020 on this titled, "In Fink We Trust," referring to Lawrence Fink. BlackRock is now the fourth branch of government. Now, what did this mean beyond that? Well, 2019 was a famous meeting of the Kansas City Federal Reserve in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This is an annual retreat where bankers and businessmen get together and discuss what's going to happen in the future. The 2019 meeting essentially put forward a plan which became known as the Great Reset. Now, this was based on a paper drafted by Philip Hildebrand, who is the vice chairman of BlackRock. He was the former chairman of the governing board of the Swiss National Bank. It was co-written by Stanley Fischer, who from 2005 to 2013 was the governor of the Bank of Israel, and then 2014 to 2017 was vice chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So you have these top international bankers drafting a proposal, and what was it all about? It was titled "Dealing with the Next Downturn: From Unconventional Monetary Policy to Unprecedented Policy Coordination." Now, what is unprecedented policy coordination? Well, if it sounds like a dictatorship, you're right. This paper argued that the monetary and budgetary policies that are in place don't work, and that the effect is that the creation of credit in the hands of the bankers is funding, well, essentially a casino. Now, did they say we should stop the casino? No, we need a third way to do it. And so they came up with a means to authorize the Fed to make purchases of private assets, including stocks and bonds, through something called a Standing Emergency Fiscal Facility. Now, essentially, this was a facility to provide bailouts that was outside of the control of Congress, elected representatives, outside of the control of a president. It would be bailouts of financial markets while at the same time controlling the creation of money and budgets. Essentially, a central bank dictatorship. That's what the Great Reset was meant to be. Now, it's running into problems, mainly because much of the world is resisting this. There's a growing opposition to these kinds of institutions that serve to loot countries that have predatory looting policies that are backed up by the military power of the US and NATO. And that's what the military-industrial financial complex is all about. That's why we have war in Ukraine, to destroy Russia as a potential alternative to the present system. That's why they're gearing up for war with China, because China, instead of going along with this, favors sovereign governments investing in the interests of their people, not in the interests of BlackRock and State Street. This is why we see BlackRock lining up to buy farmland from bankrupt farmers in Ukraine. By why we see government policies in Europe, the European Union, the German government, that are bankrupting farmers, making very valuable farmland available to these land predators of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and others. So this is where you see the merger of the military with the financial, with the political. And it's the money from this that controls the political arena. Now, I want you to take a look at the articles that are linked, read them, and think about them. Next time you hear someone talking about the military-industrial complex, as though it's some Yahoo general who wants to go to war, recognize that that Yahoo general is probably aiming to retire and join the board of one of these companies. And that's how policy is being made. That's why we're in permanent wars that don't benefit anybody in the countries in which they're located, that don't provide any security, but actually make handfuls of billionaires richer and richer. These corporate cartels have to have the power taken away from them. That means sensible regulation, and the financial institutions that they're protecting must be put through bankruptcy reorganization. So thanks for joining me today. I want you to think about this and act on it, because it's your future that depends on curbing this unlimited power of these private, greedy financiers and speculators.